Hello there, political scientists. Apparently you have remembered to bring your headphones. I do hope so. If not, then I guess this video will be viewed later. I'm going to set, with the show my homework task for the day, a A3 sheet as well that can be filled in online as I promised. However, I do have the this video, the last video, or not, we'll see how we go, on political science, and we're talking about the relationship between the executive and parliament. We've done the Supreme Court versus parliament, and we came to the conclusion that generally speaking the Supreme Court can win if it wants to. It's all a matter of will, I suppose. And we've seen some examples where they do that and some examples where they don't. Generally speaking though, Supreme Court tends to beat the executive in favour of parliament. They tend not to go against Parliament itself, rather the executive that is drawn from Parliament. Now, we've already hinted at the relationship between executive and Parliament when we're looking at the powers of the Prime Minister. And I argued that the Prime Minister has almost total control of the executive and therefore has almost total control of Parliament. I guess we need to look at that in a little bit more depth. Don't worry, there's not a great deal of knowledge to go with it. There's just a lot of examples to prove the point, I suppose. Plus, you know, you're watching this with headphones in during a day of testing, so it's going to be a fairly short video. I want to keep it simple and hopefully a little bit interesting. I suppose I really can't promise that last bit, but I'll do my best. So, without further ado, the executive versus Parliament. Observe as Boris Johnson has the same stance in both pictures, despite the fact they're taken months apart. I love that. I love that so much. The one on the right there, the one immediately below me, that's actually taken in 2021, whereas the one with his red tie there was taken in 2020. Can you tell a difference? I can't. Well, I can. The one below me, he was told off for pointing. Let's move on then. The executive versus Parliament. By the end of this, I'm hoping that you will understand three major areas where the government dominated and three areas where Parliament, I guess, dominated. I'm sorry, I'm trying to work out how I can make myself more central. There we go. For some reason, my camera, it's pointing that way, but it's not, because apparently it's directly on my eyes right now. I think I've broken it at some point. Nevertheless, let us move on. Nope, wrong button. Right button. So let's talk about parliamentary sovereignty as a start. We're going to come back to this later, but I keep using the term. Parliamentary sovereignty essentially means that Parliament is the ultimate political power living in that itty-bitty living space of the Houses of Parliament. It means that at the end of the day, the executive, being drawn from Parliament, is accountable to Parliament. There is no separation of powers between executive and legislature. The legislature essentially can hold the executive to account in a way that few political systems allow for. When we do the US, for example, later in the year, you will find that there is a separation, that the executive is very, well, it's independent. It can't be held to account by the legislature the same way that the UK executive can be. Specifically, it's the House of Commons, but I will include the House of Lords for a bit at the end that you'll see. The debate comes, well, how effective is Parliament at the job of holding executive to account? After all, that's their job, that's what they can do, but how effective are they at it? Can they make it happen as and when they wish? And the short answer is no, they can't. The longer answer is, I'm going to do it on here, we'll see how far we go. But the first thing to mention is Lord Hailsham in 1976 said of the British government that we have an elective dictatorship. That is, between general elections, there is very little that can be done by either the electorate or Parliament to rein in the power, and by rein I mean R-E-I-N, like a horse rein, not R-E-I-G-N, like a king's reign, to rein in the power of the executive. And as a consequence, they can pretty much behave as they please. They are a dictatorship. Now that's true because the British government can dominate Parliament, and there are a number of reasons why they can, but the word dominate is important. They won't always get their way, but they can dominate it and make it do more or less what they wish. People can still say what they wish. It's not a proper dictatorship where they can sort of, I don't know, be rounded up and shot. But is that a proper dictatorship? Do you need to round up people and shoot to be a dictatorship? No, you probably don't. But they can generally get what they want out of Parliament and do so without Parliament getting in the way. However, It's never static. To say that one government or one prime minister is able to run a country as a parliamentary dictatorship, in essence an elective dictatorship, doesn't mean that they do it for their entire time in office, doesn't mean it does it for an entire ministry, and just because one ministry does it doesn't mean the entire government does it. A lot depends on, well, events, dear boy, events. I probably will be using that when you get back to, but also the circumstances as they change. Obviously things change. So for example, Theresa May from around about 2016 to 2017 had pretty much the ability to behave presidentially and could control Parliament. She had enough of a majority. After 2017, that changed. So she's a really good case study of someone who shifts depending on circumstances and events and depending on what happens around the personalities involved. So how can we argue that the British government is an elective dictatorship? That seems a bit of a stretch. Well, allow me to explain. First and foremost, the executive control parliamentary business. They control the agenda. The agenda. I like agendas. Agendae? Basically, that means that there's little role for the opposition and little opportunity to debate anything that the government wishes to bring forward as legislation. They tend to get their way. They tend to decide when or if debates happen, how long they happen for, when votes are held or not. This gives them tremendous power. As I'm sure you're imagining and understanding, if you have organisational control, you can decide when or if people get to speak out against that. Secondly, public bill committees. You'll remember from when we were talking about how Parliament works that public bill committees are set up to go through new legislation and to suggest changes to it, to make it fit for purpose. But you'll also remember that public bill committees are proportional to membership of the House of Commons, implying that if you've got a strong government, you're going to get a public bill committee that is dominated in numbers by MPs from that government party. Furthermore, membership is chosen by government whip. That means if you don't do as you're told, you won't be on them. And if you don't do as you're told on them, you'll never get that job again. And these committees do come with extra remuneration. You get paid a little bit more. This is the power of patronage, and it means that the government can pretty much stack the deck in favour through any public bill committee, meaning that legislation will generally come out in a form that the government approves of, without too much in the way of Parliament being able to do much about it. If a government has a large enough majority, then they pretty much have built-in support. Any vote is going to go their way more often than not, and so they can do as they please. Remember, everybody on the government benches wants to increase their career. They're there primarily to get paid. And the Prime Minister has control over that. And the whips have control over whether or not you get reported to the Prime Minister. So, and the whips themselves are chosen by the Prime Minister. You kind of see how this works. It means that your average politician in a majority government will vote with the government, right or wrong. My local MP, Maggie Throop, has never voted against the government, even when it's meant that her positions have changed to be diametrically opposed from one thing to the next. She doesn't care. She is a government loyalist and will always back the government regardless. She's never even questioned government policy. Even if she's accidentally done so by supporting a previous government policy, she'll simply shift her position. Why? Well, she's a government loyalist. She wants a good job. She wants to be noticed. That's what they do. That's what people vote for. There's also secondary legislation. Once legislation is passed in the House of Commons, if it's just tinkering around the edges, you can pass secondary legislation, Henry VIII powers, which means that you can essentially just change the law a little bit. Sometimes this can be struck down as unlawful or ultra vires by the Supreme Court, as we've discussed with Chris Grayling. But sometimes, and more often than not, no, that's not the case. So there's less scrutiny from the House of Commons when secondary legislation is dealt with. You just sort of change bullet points and change how it works and change clauses within it because it was the original intent of the law, and therefore you're just changing the law to fit that original intent. So you can kind of do what you like, if that makes sense. And it means it doesn't get voted on, it doesn't get debated on, it doesn't get discussed by the House of Commons or the House of Lords, though there is an opportunity for the House of Lords, if you remember, to discuss secondary legislation. I'll come back to that later. The next reason why you can say we've got an elective dictatorship, I've already hinted at quite strongly, and that is the power of patronage held by the Prime Minister. It is quite an extreme power, given the breadth and depth to which they can hire and fire, choose or not choose people to do certain jobs. Prime Ministers in the UK system have a phenomenal wealth of, well, power, for want of a better phrase. They have the supreme patronage. They can appoint whoever they wish to whatever post they wish. They can even create new posts or overlook breach of the ministerial code. Priti Patel. Sorry, I've got a really bad cough. So you can do that, and that will encourage loyalty, for want of a better phrase. It will make sure that people in the House of Commons vote as you wish, discuss as you wish, and support you as you wish. That is a form of elective dictatorship. It doesn't matter what you think you're voting for as a voter, your MP ultimately will be controlled by the Prime Minister. And that means they may vote for things that you who voted for the MP might not agree with. The next is royal prerogative. Royal prerogative means that in the event of deploying armed forces to protect the national security of the UK, the Prime Minister has the power, inherited from the monarch, to deploy armed forces without recourse to Parliament. Now that has been challenged. There has been a convention set up since 2003, when Tonty Blair, went to Parliament because he wanted to make sure he had some form of backing. I mean, he did it anyway in the end, but it set that convention that any deployment of armed forces would be checked by Parliament. Now, Theresa May, when ordering the airstrikes of various Syrian installations of the Syrian government following a chemical weapons attack in 2018, did so without going to Parliament. She received opprobrium. You may remember I gave you the video clip of Jeremy Corbyn referring back to Robin Cook's understanding of the convention, the importance of Robin Cook and the importance of cabinet. So there is a convention, but it has been ignored by Theresa May. It hasn't been tested yet by Boris Johnson, and we'll see what happens. Though my suspicion will be that it will be ignored. Though it could go to a vote just to prove a point, because I think he'll win it. It doesn't matter what the case is, you'll note. There's also the Salisbury Convention, which means that any potential opposition in the House of Commons can't really look for support from the House of Lords. Theoretically, the House of Lords is going to leave alone anything that's in a manifesto. That's what the Salisbury Convention says. If a government is elected with a manifesto, anything that's in that manifesto cannot and will not be opposed by the House of Lords, because it would be unseemly to do so. And that grew from the 1945 election of the Labour government and the House of Lords' natural distrust of what they were doing, but also the recognition of the fact that they'd won a landslide election, and it would probably not be a good idea following the Second World War. So they didn't. It became known as the Salisbury Convention after Lord Salisbury. So let's have a look at some elective dictatorships. Let's have a look at some examples. Don't worry, there aren't many. And a bit like with the Supreme Court, I'm doing imperial purple rather than blue. But yeah, a bit like that. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of depth. These are your examples. Make of them what you will. The first is Thatcher's government between 1979 and 1987. Note, not from 1988 onwards, for reasons I'll get into another time perhaps. But basically, Thatcher's government was unified versus Labour's division. Labour's division had only intensified since 1979 with things like militant tendency, and it meant that basically they couldn't offer a united opposition. They offered a split opposition. Indeed, from 1981, there'd actually been a split between the left and the centre-right in the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, the Gang of Four that split, which kind of ruined the 1983 election. There was talk of them winning all of the seats, the SDP that is, but they won none of the seats, like none of them. So, yeah. Also, there's something called the Falklands Effect, and that comes in two ways. Winning the Falklands War may or may not have affected the general election, but certainly it affected the way that people thought about the government. It gave them a moral power that they didn't have beforehand. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not there is something called the Falklands Effect. Falklands Effect. Falklands Effect, there we go. In terms of voting behaviour. A lot of the stats and figures and the research would indicate that maybe there isn't any such thing. However, it was an effect in terms of political ideology, and it was an effect in terms of whether or not Parliament would go against Thatcher and her government. So it does matter. They also had a majority after the 1983 election of 144 seats, meaning that basically Thatcher could do as she wished with her executive, knowing that she had a pretty much guaranteed win. That would require a significant rebellion from her own party in order to scupper any of her legislation. And that only happened once. I'll come on to that later. Also, there's no chance of an effective opposition because they were so divided and because they were so weak compared to this strong government with a majority of 144 seats. There was very little that they could actually do. It was compounded by the two leaders of the opposition. Michael Foot was a relic from a former age, a very good parliamentarian, an excellent MP, but ill-suited to the early 1980s because he just wasn't photogenic. He wasn't good with the TV. He wasn't good at the zeitgeist. We've talked about this before, tapping into what people are thinking and how they work and the cultural references and touchstones of a generation. Michael Foot was a fantastic MP, knew exactly what he was doing. Look him up sometime. He was a rubbish party leader. I mean, very well respected, don't get me wrong. Held the party together, don't get me wrong. But he wasn't going to appeal. It wasn't going to work against Thatcher. Neil Kinnock, arguably slightly better, but still, and forgive me, he was still Neil Kinnock. And forgive me for going into stereotypes, but he was ginger, balding, and from Wales. These things didn't bode well. What is surprising is how well he did, given how much these things were played on by the media. But it did mean that Thatcher, pretty much between these years, for these 8 years, was imperial. She was Empress Thatcher in many ways. Hence my image. There we go. Why did that? I hope that animated at your end. It didn't look like it animated this end. Hang on. There we go. That animated properly. If it did first time, I apologise. It didn't look like it when I was looking at the video. So then we've got Tonty Blair. He is behind this. Emperor Blair from 1997 to 2001. Check out that image. These are people swamping. And now if you look closely, down here, there's someone trying to get a signed photograph of Blair. Here's his wife with Cherie Blair with flowers. These are just supporters in the street. They're not even party members. It was bonkers at this point just how much Tony Blair had support of people in the country. There was a landslide election, a landslide election victory, general election in 1997, gaining New Labour a 179 seat majority. That is phenomenal. Bear in mind, Thatcher only had 144. I say only had 144. This meant that New Labour was pretty much guaranteed a win in any parliamentary debate. And Labour itself was united around this idea of the third way, a sort of ideological halfway house between socialism and capitalism, developed and fronted by Tonty Blair himself. We don't talk about it very much, but we will talk about it later when we do ideologies and the core ideologies. We'll talk about the third way. It was immensely popular and united New Labour around their leader. Again, I come back to that image. There are lots of images like that from 1997 right the way through to 2001. Tonty Blair was phenomenally, personally popular, and that means that his government pretty much had an elective dictatorship position. Within that, the Conservatives suffered their worst defeat since 1832, with just 165 MPs, meaning that there was literally nothing they could do. They could be as united as you like, and they still wouldn't have made much headway. They were titchy, they were tiny, they were ignorable, and so they were. And they were divided anyway over the EU, and well, as we know, they never really fixed those divisions. Oh no! Now my video's gone completely pap. Are we back? I think we're back. Everything just froze for a moment. I hope that the video is unaffected. If it is, I apologise. I was basically saying that the Conservatives were hopelessly divided over the EU, and there was literally nothing they could do. Also, they were led by William Hague. There's a video clip down the bottom of there, the news report of when William Hague won the leadership of the Conservative Party. I just want you to watch it. It's about 4 minutes long. You get a feel for the man, and maybe you can tell me when we get back why it was that he was a bit of an ineffective leader of the opposition under Tony Blair. You've seen Tony Blair summing up the mood of the people, the zeitgeist, with Princess Diana. She was the people's princess. Contrast that with William Hague, well, you'll be able to tell me when we meet next. And then surprisingly, there's the coalition government of 2010 to 2015. Not something you would necessarily have expected. The coalition government meant that the 306 Conservative seats were added to 57 Liberal Democrat seats, giving them a massive majority of, what would that be, 363 seats, compared to 258 Labour. Now, 258 is fairly respectable, but not enough to take on 360 odd. So that was a problem. Furthermore, they agreed the Fixed Term Parliament Act in 2011, meaning that the next general election was set for 2015. There was no real chance of a snap election, meaning that the government was pretty secure, meaning that they could do what they wanted. They knew how long they had. They could pass on popular legislation in the early years and then pass more popular legislation later. They could blame each other. It was a coalition. And it meant that they could survive significant rebellions, such as that over tuition fees, when I think it was 27 Liberal Democrat MPs voted against it. That was huge for the Liberal Democrats. It was a drop in the ocean when it came to the whole government. This gave them the power to be an elective dictatorship. There was no need to temper anything, and there was no chance of Parliament reining them in, R-E-I-N, as in horse reins, because the government could do as they wish. Now, you might think that's surprising. When we talked about the coalition government, about the power of the Prime Minister, we said, yeah, it could have strengthened his hand, but the Quad meant that there was more than the Prime Minister involved, which is an effective argument, I guess. But here, when you're talking about the executive versus Parliament, it's a different kettle of fish. They obviously dominate. But it's not always the case that you've got an elective dictatorship just because you've got a government. So if you've got a minority or a small majority government, a minority government is a government that's in power but doesn't have enough seats to guarantee a win in every general election. So you fall short of, is it 312 you need, or 300 and... No, wait, how many do you need? 650, so you need 326. You fall short of the 326 seats required for a parliamentary majority, but you are still in government. And this has happened in a number of occasions, and we will tackle them. And if you've got a government with a tiny majority, say your majority is only 1 or 2, then yeah, you're less powerful. You're at the whim of a couple of rebels at any moment who could scupper it for you, meaning that backbenchers in your own government might see calls with the opposition and then make you lose a vote. You have to be very careful to keep everybody online. Your tremendous powers of patronage as a Prime Minister might not translate as effectively as they do when you can pretty much guarantee a win in any given parliamentary vote. Also, if you're facing a united opposition and they are widely tipped to win the next general election, then that means that the media will turn against you. The media will curry favour with the projected next government leader. Of course they will. That's what they do. John Major found this to his cost, for example. But John Major wouldn't have counted as an elective dictatorship in the first place, because he was never that powerful. But he did find it from 92 right the way through to 97. Everyone expected Blair to form the next government, and media behaved accordingly, and so did the people of the country, meaning that even had John Major been powerful, he would have struggled to maintain any kind of effective authority over Parliament between 92 and 97. You'll note that he's not one of my examples. Finally, even a powerful government, though, can't necessarily take Parliament for granted. I was expecting examples to come in here. So Thatcher in 1986 lost the Shops Bill because there were 72 rebels in government that voted against it. Yeah, I could have sworn there was something supposed to come in here. Have I broken it? Have I broken my own animations? Hang on. Right, I'm going to pause on Thatcher. let's do these first. These were supposed to come in first. I've messed up the order. Examples of governments that were reined in by Parliament start with Labour between 1974 and 1979. Labour's victory in 1974 gave them a majority of 3. That is titchy. And you can see why that could be a problem. Just 2 rebels, and that's it. You lose a vote. So, yeah, they were already on the ropes. And then, in 1976, they actually became a minority government because they'd lost some by-elections, meaning that, although there hadn't been a general election, they didn't have a majority in Parliament. They arranged a confidence and supply agreement with the Liberals, meaning that the Liberals would support them in a vote of no confidence and would support them in legislation that they supported between 1977 and 1978. But then that fell down when the Liberals refused to keep it going, and they struggled. For the last year of the administration under Callaghan, they really struggled to win parliamentary votes and to get their legislative agenda pushed through, meaning there was a vote of no confidence in 1979, a snap general election, which led to a surprise Thatcher victory, though, in retrospect, maybe not that surprising. Another example of weak government is Tony Blair again, though segueing into Golden Brown, 2005 to 2010. Blair's popularity had been declining since 2003 in the Iraq War. I said a long time ago when we were talking about pressure groups that the pressure groups for Stop the War coalition didn't really make that much difference. Well, they kind of did in terms of not directly affecting government business, but by making it far harder for Tony Blair to continue his time in office. The general election in 2005 left him with just a 66 majority in the House of Commons, meaning that it was almost impossible for him to push through with the same confidence that he had done in, say, 2001 or even 1997. Indeed, the 2005 general election, Labour just received 35.2% of the popular vote. It made it very hard to suggest that they were a popular government backed by the majority of the country because, well, they weren't. And that was one of the lowest supports for a government ever. In 2005, as a consequence of these things, the Blair government lost their very first parliamentary vote, the terrorism bill, which, yeah, we've talked about that extensively. When Brown came to office and became Prime Minister in 2007, he did so against a newly confident opposition led by David Cameron, call me Dave. And it was fairly obvious that in any general election, Cameron would probably be heading the next government. Now, I say fairly obvious, you'll note that they ended in a coalition government, it wasn't that clear cut. But at the time, everyone assumed that Cameron would be the next Prime Minister and that Golden Brown would not be. As a consequence, you had the predictable change in the way that Parliament worked. And then from 2008 onwards, there was the global economic crisis, which the Conservatives were successfully able to pin on Labour, which I don't understand. It was a global thing, but they did it, and it still works even now. The idea that Labour bankrupted the UK. They didn't. The UK's never been bankrupt. But it looked that way, and even though Brown's response to the economic crisis actually worked, it didn't do him any favours. And then, of course, we come to May. 2017 to 2019. Now, the textbook doesn't go as far as I can here because, well, the textbook didn't know the full story, and we do. There was a snap general election in which she lost her majority. Surprisingly, people were predicting a 400-seat majority. I'm not even joking. She was tipped to win 441 seats in the 2017 election. Loads of people argued that this was a masterful stroke of when she called it, how she called it, and that Labour had voted for their own extinction through the Fixed Term Parliament Act. You had to have 2/3 majority to call the general election in Parliament, and that they were idiots and they were going to lose so badly that they'd be removed as a parliamentary force. Indeed, it was widely supposed that Jeremy Corbyn was so unpopular they'd be lucky to scrape 100 seats. There were predictions saying that they'd get as few as 65 parliamentary seats, that they would become the third party after the Liberal Democrats with a supermajority for a Conservative election. That didn't happen. We know what happened afterwards. People at the time did not. They all